Will the BRICS survive a Trump presidency? Now that's a pretty binary question. Obviously, the real question we're going to ask is how will BRICS be impacted by a Trump presidency? Now, we've talked a lot about Trump today on this stage. We've talked a lot about how he comes in the door super hot and then calms down and slides in the real demands. Yeah. And so when it comes to BRICS, we've heard threats like 100% tariffs on trade done in non-US dollars. For context, we also heard 25% tariff on day one. Instead, they decided to study it a little bit longer. Come in the door hot, and then buy some time and slide in what you really want. So, Andy, I'm going to throw it over to you. We're going to come back this way. What's the primary impact? See, if I was Trump, I think that this would be a tipping point for the BRICS, right? Because either I'm serious with my threats, and that's going to harden the resolve of BRICS nations to bind together tighter, right? Alternatively, I'm a deal guy. I'm going to go to Brazil and maybe boost agriculture exports. I'm going to go to India and offer some power balance against China. I'm going to offer investment in South Africa. I'm China's biggest customer, right? There's angles, right? And he's a deal guy. So what's your take?
I mean, you would think that would be the way to do it. I mean, it's been 4 years of the stick rather than the carrot. I think that would be the way to do it if he was smart. He would come in hot and then, you know, reconcile with a deal that is mutually beneficial. But I don't know that doesn't stop the de-dollarization, you know? 36 trillion in debt on top of 175 trillion in unfunded liabilities, and in some, I guess you could say, a debt trap. Maybe perhaps interest rates going higher, making it more difficult, and less demand for the 10-year Treasury, which, you know, these are not tariffs, really. They're sanctions masquerading as tariffs as far as I'm concerned. So the first thing would be to back off from that and try and be more friendly and extend the olive branch. And I guess we'll see if he does that, but I think that would be the way to certainly make it more difficult on the BRICS to have this growing cohesive safety in numbers type of movement.
Okay, and Taylor, I want to throw you a similar question. Trump coming to power, is this a unifying moment, or is this a new obstacle and a big one for the BRICS nations?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And I absolutely think unifying, right? We have a new president, and I think Trump is focused on the next 4 years. I think BRICS is focused on the next forever. You know, the train left the station a long time ago. To think it's going to stop or turn around, it just doesn't make sense to me, because I agree that, you know, tariffs, it's really just another weaponization. It's the root cause of why they're doing this in the first place. Right. So I think that what we could see is that instead of the train slowing, it could actually just be moving at night instead of during the day. Yesterday we were talking about maybe resources that weren't as visible. I think that BRICS has been very vocal about what they've been doing, how they've been moving forward, what their goals are. Maybe we don't hear as much in the news, potentially, but I think that would be a mistake to mistake that as them not making progress.
Yes, okay, I love that. Trump is thinking 4 years, BRICS is thinking forever. How amazing was that, by the way? Okay, Matthew, over to you. Same question, love to hear your perspective on this subject. Trump is the obstacle, Trump is the unifying force, what is he?
I think with Trump and the BRICS, we have a fundamental misunderstanding of who the real sucker is. Trump's been using this word, we're not going to be the sucker. Yeah. And I think you could say the same about BRICS not wanting to be a sucker. And I think, in all fairness to Trump, whatever we think of him, love him or hate him, he means what he says, he's going to do what he says. Whether it works the way he says it will is an open question to speculate on, and we'll watch it play in the next 2 to 4 years. Trump, again, feels like America's been a sucker because he sees the offshoring of jobs. I think when your iPhones and Nikes are made in China, that's because the CEOs of those companies decided to do that, not China. But nevertheless, that bothers him. The $300+ billion trade deficit with the BRICS, that bothers him. For national security, Douglas Macgregor would say the same, Colonel Macgregor would say, if a lot of our chips for our weapons are made in China, that's a national security problem. So Trump feels like that's us being a sucker. We need to do something different vis-a-vis the BRICS. Fine, we could argue whether he's right or wrong. If you take the other side of the case from the BRICS perspective, well, they're going to say, who's the sucker? It's been us for generations. We've got a generation that's been inheriting U.S. inflation. We have a generation that's basically been suffering the usury of the IMF and the World Bank, and lots of strings attached to that system. We're going to create a different system. As importantly, we've been We've been the victims of a weaponized world reserve currency. That's a problem. We've had the U.S. Treasury be the tail that wags our dog for a generation. That U.S. Treasury is from a broken issuer. It doesn't even beat inflation in the last 5 years. So who's the sucker from the BRICS perspective? So you have two parties who equally feel aggrieved, I think sincerely so. We can debate who's right or wrong. Unlike Trudeau, unlike Canada, I don't see them going back with their tail between their legs the way Trudeau did after going to Mar-a-Lago. I don't think Canada is the same as the BRICS. And by the way, even Canada, the tariffs that he was threatening, which is outside of the BRICS, that's changed as well. Because I think Trump finally realized that Canada buys more stuff out of the US than China, France, Japan, and the UK combined. So you can speak softly and carry a big stick like Theodore Roosevelt, or Trump, you can speak loudly and carry a big stick, but he did change his ways a little bit. I think it's going to be very different for the BRICS. I think it's far more, the genie's out of the bottle, it's irrevocable, it's more forever. Trump has really 2 years before the midterms to make changes, so it's going to be a bull in a china shop or an elephant in a china shop, and it's going to be very interesting next couple of years. Absolutely.
Yes, okay. So to summarize, to a degree, what we may expect is momentum to continue, but maybe quieter, right? If this is a 4-year period of time where we can expect more public-facing resistance and loud noise to any developments, that's what we're going to get, right? But the resolve is there, and the resolve comes from long-standing issues, as you mentioned, Matthew. So, Andy, would you judge this assessment correctly? There was a lot of noise and development and countries raising their hand to join BRICS like 12 months ago, and that got a lot quieter in the last quarter. Is that a fair assessment, and do you think that's directly in response to the U.S. election that's now happened, entering maybe that quiet period?
The meeting in, not the one in Kazan, the one before it, in Novigrad.
Yeah.
Putin came out and said that 35 or 40 companies have formally expressed interest. I think another 9 have been added as member states. Indonesia just joined as a full member. Nigeria just joined. Indonesia is the biggest deposit of nickel in the world. Yeah. Their president, Widodo, said we should call for an OPEC-style cartel. So they are growing, but you're right, we're not hearing it as open. In fact, a lot of the things they're doing, I think are going to be under the radar. For example, we've seen China say that they stopped buying gold for 6 months, yet the import-export numbers out of London and Switzerland betrayed that rhetoric. And in fact, there's a feeling that they've been buying 10 times as much gold as they said. Saudi Arabia, same thing. Oh, sorry, we forgot to report it to the IMF, but the import-export numbers caught it. So I think this de-dollarization trend is going to continue. And maybe they realized, with what we talked about yesterday with the BIS and the way that they pulled out of Enbridge at the last minute, that trying to be open and forthright with the West maybe isn't the best plan. Maybe it allows them to kind of straddle the line as Saudi Arabia is doing, straddling the line, but yet their actions, you look at when they had that meeting in Novigrad, it coincided with the G7 meeting, and they turned down, they being the Saudis, an invitation to the G7 and sent their delegates to the BRICS meeting. So it's straddling a line. It's not being open, completely open until all the ducks are in a row. But yeah, to your point, we're not hearing anywhere near as much as we've heard over the last 3 years, which was this rapidly growing trend. And I think that has to do with the pushback from the West. So maybe the art of war, misdirection, not be completely forthright about what you're doing, but at the same time, your actions, if you look closely, seem to be hedging towards further de-dollarization.
Okay, I want to follow that thread. First, I want to press into my first question just a little bit harder. So if you were in the president's seat and you wanted to break up this alliance, there's angles to do that, right? They're ideologically very different countries. India and China are in open conflicts through their border in the Himalayas. It's been a hot zone, right? Weapons, right? It's not widely reported, but it exists. Those two countries have been able to be sort of at war and at peace at the same time. It's quite a remarkable relationship. So do you expect angles like that from the president? He's a deal guy. I would expect he's going to look for them. I would. Do you expect that? Do you expect to see that?
Well, there was a big point made at that meeting in Novigrad for Xi and Modi that met on the sidelines to address this issue.
Right.
And maybe the question is, you know, my enemy's enemy is my friend type of deal.
Sure.
But yes, you would expect in a espionage CIA world of trying to exploit those trigger points. I don't know. I mean, they've made a big deal about peace. You see Iran and Saudi Arabia take part in joint naval exercises. You're seeing China come in and broker peace deals between Iran and Saudi Arabia as being the adults in the room. You're seeing railways and roads being built for the first time ever between Iran and Iraq. They are trying to build this infrastructure. And I think one of the things that's not talked about enough is what happened recently with China and kind of their way of saying, don't try it, U.S. And not enough people are talking about this, but this was their issuance of $2 billion worth of U.S.-denominated bonds in Riyal in Saudi Arabia that was 20 times oversubscribed, that were rated A+ by Fitch, and had a lower interest rate than U.S. Treasuries. And that, when you have a slightly lower yield, that would speak to the creditworthiness or the risk. So China is able, with their $1 trillion trade surplus, to issue U.S. Treasuries, paying in Chinese bonds denominated in U.S. dollars that will compete directly with the U.S. Treasury market. That money then doesn't go back to the U.S. And I think what they're doing with this is saying, look, we can do this with all of our Belt Road Initiative countries. We can help them with their dollar-denominated debt. That's the milkshake theory. Everyone needs these dollars to pay their debt. Well, we got $1 trillion a year that we can issue. If $2 billion were 20 times oversubscribed in Saudi Arabia, what if we made it 20 billion or 100 billion in dollars, and instead of being paid back in dollars, we can be paid back in resources from the Belt Road, or we can be paid back in yuan. It's a way for them to say, we can challenge you right now in the Treasury market, don't mess with us. And this is something that I think this year, if Trump pushes, you will see more and more of these bonds being issued by China in US dollars to compete on a parallel system with the U.S., and that's something that very quickly, I think, would rattle the bushes, so to speak.
So let me go to you next, Taylor, and maybe it's a decent segue into, you know, what we can expect in terms of alternatives to SWIFT from BRICS countries. So, you know, it's easy to say countries can trade in non-US dollars, but actually it's really hard, because if you're Indonesia and you want to buy something in rupiah, well, not a lot of countries have any use for rupiah, right? What are you going to do with that? You need a standard settlement currency. So there's been efforts, obviously Enbridge, we talked about a lot yesterday. What's your take, Taylor, on new financial rails in place that can be high functioning enough to displace USD?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a common tendency by people in the West to dismiss progress that's being made as disappointments on the BRICS side, like whether it's promises that haven't been delivered on, whether that was a gold-backed currency or a basket of currency or Enbridge, whether or not that was their doing or the BIS pulling out from Western influence. But really what that is, it's not a disappointment, it's progress. They are making progress. While the BIS might have pulled out of that, does not mean that that technology went away, right? The need for a neutral currency, for a settlement currency that's neutral, is there. It's the future. And the technology now exists to support it. It's not going away. It's going to be called something different. It might look different.
The Enbridge technology has been built. It exists.
Absolutely, and it's viable, right? And we know that now. It's a proven fact. So while it might be called something different or look slightly different, it's there and it's the future. And to act like it's not, only the people on top are the ones who are resistant to change. I know yesterday there was a lot of talk about the rest of the world changing and not the United States. And it's because, it's easier to get to the top than to stay on top. And I think we're digging our heels in, but we're fighting the inevitable.
Don't be shy. If you do not know what Enbridge is, would you mind giving me a wave? Yeah, there's enough for you. Taylor, could you just provide like the Coles notes on, and draw whatever parallels you need to? Enbridge, what are we talking about?
Yeah, for sure. So like you mentioned, it's actually surprising how many people aren't aware that it's not easy to just trade in currencies, right? Right now, the infrastructure that's in place, SWIFT, is Western controlled. US has a huge influence in that, right? Dollar. This would be an alternative payment system. Now, a big difference is that it is blockchain technology. But ultimately, BRICS too, there's a misconception that they're just focused on the dollar, but it's a lot of these different things that are in place. The BIS, the IMF, they're all Western controlled. That's why they're creating their own infrastructure and their own institutions to rival the West. This is one piece of that puzzle. An analogy I used yesterday, too, in explaining this to people, this technology that's here to stay, is I draw a parallel to the early 2000s when Napster came out and digital downloads were there. And it might sound like a funny analogy, but what did the music industry do? They dug their heels in. They said, absolutely not. No digital downloads, right? Because it didn't benefit them initially. But the people were there. They saw the technology. They knew that they needed it. And eventually, of course, now I can't imagine a world without digital downloads. What did the music industry have to do? They had to adapt. And they did. The United States is going to be forced to adapt. Now, I agree with Andy that all branches the way here, right? I mean, BRICS wants a seat at the table. I think it would be better if we invited them to our dinner party versus having them knock down the door, or if we bolt the door, they're going to come in through the window.
Yeah, okay. By the way, this is Taylor's first time at the VRIC. So happy to get her here up from Arizona. She hosts a show called Taylor Made Economics. It's phenomenal. I recommend you check that out. You can find it on YouTube. Okay, I want to move on to a different subject here, kind of parallel to this. We could say that the United States has become a bit inflated and lazy from a geopolitical standpoint because they've been the hegemon for so long. They've been unchallenged, right, since the Soviet Union. Therefore, a challenger should strengthen them. If the first part's true, the opposite should be true as well, that we're all better under pressure. We're all better when there's competition. We're all better when we're challenged. So is there an angle there that this is exactly what the United States needs, a legitimate, unified, global challenger to arrive in the scene for some meaningful changes to occur? What's your take, Matthew?
I was reading recently about Trump being a winner, but not a leader. And what the distinction was, when you're a winner, there's always a binary event. There's a winner, and there has to be a loser. And if you're a leader, you're looking to kind of cooperate, coalesce, compromise, not just meet somewhere in the middle, but kind of come with the John Nash equilibrium, a win-win where we get really creative. And sometimes when you're being challenged by the inevitable changes, if you're not going to resist them and you're thinking like a leader, you're going to come up with a way where we come up with something win-win, which isn't just meeting in the middle or compromising, or certainly not trying to destroy each other, but outperform each other. And that would require a certain mentality. Again, love or hate Trump, he's not a leader, he's a winner. He said the word winner probably 5 or 6 times in the last 5 minutes of his inaugural speech. It's the way he's wired. I'm not sure if he's the individual to do that kind of evolution of thinking and compromise. I think he's going in. If you want a dog, ask for a horse. Art of the deal. Again, big stick, big mouth, make things happen. I think he's underestimating the changes that are happening. I'm not sure if the team around him is underestimating, but to some of the nuances, whether it's the infrastructure, the technology, the things happening, the creative things happening with debt and debt issuance. Necessity is a mother invention, and we saw it for Smoot-Hawley in 1930. The countries affected by tariffs get very creative, very smart, and they grow and they evolve. It didn't do well for Hoover, Smoot, or Hawley after that failed tariff. I'm not saying Trump's will fail as fast, but history does rhyme. What's most interesting, I thought, about the recent get-together with the BRICS was the fact that Saudi and the UAE were even there. And I joke, I've used this analogy, I probably overused it, but I'd say it real quickly. If you're at dinner with your girlfriend and there's a handsome waiter and she spends more time looking at the waiter than you, it doesn't mean the relationship is over, but it's probably going to be a strange conversation on the drive home, and there's probably tension. And the fact that UAE and Saudi, let's not underestimate the power of the petrodollar and the power of energy in US dollars and what that means for America and what it means for the Trump administration. The fact that the UAE and Saudi were looking at the waiter, looking at doing oil energy trades outside of the dollar, and gosh knows China's #1 issue is a non-dollar energy solution. Kyle Bass solved this years ago. That's massive ramifications for the dollar that I don't know if Trump and his team fully can solve. It's not the end of the petrodollar. It certainly isn't going to happen overnight. Just like the BRICS isn't going to replace the world reserve currency. It's not even a BRICS currency, as we know. It's a trading settlement. A lot of hype, a lot of misunderstanding, but we're clearly in a multipolar world, in some ways multi-dysfunctional. There's a lot of problems in Russia, a lot of problems in China. India and Brazil, very different than Russia and China. There's certainly a lot of problems in the US, but it is changing, and it's irrevocable change now. And I think if we can accept we're in a multipolar, multi-economic world, it'll be easier. I'm not sure Trump's going to be the guy to accept that. That's my thought.
I got to ask you a question on that. You said the #1 challenge China's facing is they need a non-US dollar energy system.
Absolutely.
And they're building like 150 nuclear power plant facilities right now. That's in the plan. Do you think that's directly related? They can source the uranium from Russia and the Kazakhs and step outside the petrodollar from that perspective? Does that make sense?
I'm sure it's part of the playbook, but they're not going to, oil and energy is not going to become obsolete that fast. And I think, look, I think plan B, I think the sanctions were not even plan B, they were plan A. Again, Russia and China have been de-dollarizing since 2013, 2014. This just gave them, the weaponization gave them the pretext. But I think, look, what was again, I've said this openly, whatever you think of the war in the Ukraine, and there's fine debate on that. I personally was against it. I thought it was the biggest State Department failure in our history. I thought sanctioning a nuclear power as part of a BRICS, as the world's largest oil exporter, who's in bed with one of the world's largest oil importers, and weaponizing the world reserve currency was a massive mistake. And so when we did that, all that did, regardless of however, and Russia and China have different opinions on some things, but they have no doubt that Russia likes to give its oil to China, and China wants that oil. And the fact that China will pay for that oil in yuan, and Russia will take it, use that yuan to buy goods in China that were once made in America, and then whatever the delta is, whatever is left over is in gold, which goes in the Shanghai exchange, it can be reconverted into rubles. It's a beautiful system. It's a scalable system. And so that energy is a key part. When we sanctioned Russia, we just put them closer into the honeymoon suite with China. And again, that was not far-sighted thinking. Many of us, we talked about this last year on the panel, and certainly Jim Rickards at the War College in Carlisle, he was trying to warn this was a disastrous, short-sighted policy, and the ramifications are massive now. Nuclear definitely changes in China and Russia, but that oil trade is seismic in its ramifications.
When we get into these sort of big macro disruptive trends, and then people always ask, so what's the investment angle here? Right, what's the play? And my answer is usually like, go to work, like build something, generate income, like don't worry about it. Go back to work, you'll be just fine. But there's bigger stories as well in the background, and maybe how you're storing your wealth really matters in those disruptive moments, especially during times of currency change. Luke Groman, a phenomenal analyst, has a great quote. He says, there's very few moments in history when you want to own gold, but during those moments, it's about the only thing that you want to own. I don't know if we're heading towards one of those moments or not, but what's the panel's perspective? Andy, I'll start with you and come back towards Matthew here.
Well, in my mind, there's no reason that the BIS would have reclassified gold as the world's only other Tier 1 reserve asset. There's no other reason that the central banks have been the biggest buyers of gold over the last several years. They're the most well-funded, but more relevant, the most well-informed. And when you see over 40 nations repatriate their gold from the New York Fed and the Bank of England, it becomes even more concerning. So I think gold is something, I look at what Zoltan Pozsar said, I think it's the perfect way to underscore, to explain very clearly where we are. Bretton Woods won, the system that the dollar took over for the pound sterling after the war. Bretton Woods 2, loosely, the petrodollar, and you could argue that's coming to an end. The Saudis did not re-up the exclusivity deal at the 50-year anniversary. They didn't say we won't take dollars, but they said we're open to taking other currencies. They're straddling the BRICS. UAE, as Matthew said, is a full member. Nigeria just joined. These are moments where I think Zoltan Pozsar is dead on. Bretton Woods 3, a system that will be denominated by, or not described by, transparency in commodities. So for me, the fact that the most relevant, powerful, well-informed bank in the world reclassified gold as Tier 1 and the central banks are reconfirming that by their purchases tells me gold will be part of the system, period. And a bank like that wouldn't reclassify Tier 1, wouldn't do that if it weren't thought out and planned. So yeah, I think gold will be front and center in what comes next. And perhaps to Judy Shelton's plan, the way to inspire confidence in the U.S. Treasury is to back it by gold. And that is what she wants to do, have it deliverable in gold after a 50-year duration. So I guess we'll see. But yeah, to me, gold is wealth, and the more things change, the more they stay the same. The central banks are proving that.
I love it, Andy. Thank you. Taylor, any comments?
Yeah, I mean, people ask me all the time, they say, when is the dollar going to collapse, right? It's like, okay, well, no one has a crystal ball, but what I always say is, I'm like, de-dollarization is a process, not an event. It's a process that's clearly happening. Look at all the things that Andy just listed out, right? We know all these threats are happening. We know it's accelerating. We can feel it happening as we lead to this reset. Ultimately, absolutely, fiat currency, we know that we cannot trust it because it's losing value every day. So as the world is moving towards a sound money, gold, it's clear that this is what central banks are doing. This is what BRICS are doing. This is absolutely what I'd recommend to protect yourself.
Okay, back to hard assets.
Absolutely.
Real things. Matthew, any comments?
Obviously, I'm going to echo the sentiment. You know, and again, we're all in a circular trust of data analysis, data mining. But you know, it's not just talking your book. I couldn't agree more on the BIS. But look, you're Canadians. Do you know Wayne Gretzky? How do you play hockey well? You don't play where the puck sits. You play where the direction it's heading. We've been seeing the direction of central banks since 2014, net selling U.S. Treasuries. Why? Because it's from a broke issuer, the U.S., debt-soaked nation. It's IOU, doesn't beat inflation. It's not trusted after it's been weaponized. So there's been a net sale of U.S. Treasuries and a net purchase of physical gold. That's the direction of the puck. It's not a gold bug bias. It's not yes saying our book. It's just the march of history, slow but steady. It doesn't mean that gold only goes in a straight line. It doesn't mean that the U.S. dollar is not going to be a world reserve currency. It doesn't mean the BRICS are replacing it. The U.S. dollar is not going anywhere. It's going to be repriced. And so you don't have to be dramatic. You just have to be objective. Believe it or not, you can be gold high conviction and still be objective. And there are still risks in the gold market, of course. But it is the only money that's lasted. It's been here since 480 BC. It's literally older than the solar system. And a little fun fact, in every one of our bodies, there's 0.2 milligrams of physical gold in our blood system. It's just a fun fact, but I think gold is more than just a pet rock. Yeah, it's analog, it's not sexy, it's not making the headlines now in a strategic Bitcoin reserve, however strategic that is. But I'm saying, look what the central banks are doing. They're saving in gold and they're spending in fiat. And as much as I dislike the BIS and central banks, they're not stupid. There's a reason they're doing that.
There's a reason they're doing that. Yeah, key point. Okay, thank you so much for joining me up on stage today. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.